You weren't a waitress, just a girl with hand-me-down dog tags and too many shifts. That's what the boys at the corner booth whispered, laughing under their breath as they stirred their coffee and kicked their boots up on the vinyl. She didn't answer, didn't even flinch, just set down their plates, balanced on her arm with the quiet precision of someone who had once carried more than food through crowded halls. And yet, the sound of their laughter followed her to the counter like a shadow. Before I take you into what happened next, if you agree that honor never fades, even when the uniform does, make sure to like and subscribe, because this story is one of those reminders you don't want to forget. Clara Mitchell was 27, a number that sat awkwardly between the restless energy of youth and the steady weight of experience. She moved with that kind of calm efficiency people mistake for timidity. A gray apron tied loosely around her waist, hair pulled back in a simple knot, sleeves rolled just high enough to keep the grease stains off. On her chest, visible only when she leaned forward to pour coffee, hung a pair of old, weathered dog tags. No shine left on them, edges dulled by time. The letters almost faded into anonymity. She wore them not for attention, but because without them she felt unfinished. They were the only piece of her past she hadn't been able to leave behind. The diner itself was nothing special, just another roadside pit stop on the edge of town, where the smell of burnt bacon lived in the curtains and the jukebox hadn't played a new song since her parents were in high school. Truckers came through, families with restless kids, and sometimes, more often than not, young men in fatigues or fresh recruits still wearing their bravado like second skin. It was the kind of place that fed everyone and remembered no one. Except Clara. She remembered everything. She remembered the way soldiers walked when they came in on leave, how the confident stride softened once they sat down and saw home on the other side of a window pane. She remembered the weight of silence after deployments, the unspoken things tucked into smiles and quick laughter. She remembered because she had lived it. But the world inside the diner didn't know that. To them, she was just the girl with the coffee pot, the one who slipped an extra slice of pie to the truckers and always had a refill ready before anyone asked. They didn't know that the tags around her neck weren't borrowed from some surplus store or given to her by a boyfriend overseas. They were hers, issued in her name, stamped with numbers and blood type that once meant life or death. And if she seemed older than her years, if her eyes sometimes carried a weight too heavy for 27, that wasn't something she offered freely. That night, the laughter had started small, just a murmur when she leaned over to clear plates. A snicker at the metallic clink of the tags against her necklace. Then louder, bolder, once they saw she didn't rise to the bait. "Hey, waitress," one of them said, leaning back in his chair, a smirk tugging at his mouth. "Where do you get those?" "You bet." The others chuckled, elbows nudging each other, eyes daring her to answer. She didn't. Just stacked the dishes, wiped the table, and moved on. The kind of silence that, to them, sounded like surrender. Silence was safer. She had learned that years ago. Silence was how you endured briefings that ended with body counts, how you waited out the long hours between bursts of chaos, how you bore the stares of people who would never understand what it meant to come home with less than you left. Silence was the shield she carried now, here, in a greasy diner where the greatest danger was hot coffee spilling on her hand. But to those boys, silence was weakness. And so the jokes kept coming. "Bet she got them off her ex," another chimed in. "Some poor guy probably never even came back." More laughter. Forks clattered against plates. Even the manager at the counter, half buried in receipts, let a smile twitch at the corner of his mouth. No one stopped it. Why would they? To them, it was harmless fun, a few jokes at the expense of a girl too quiet to fight back. To Clara, it was just another reminder that the world she had returned to wasn't built to remember. She carried the plates back to the sink, the smell of fried onions clinging to her hands, and for a moment she allowed herself to glance at the reflection in the stainless steel. The tags rested just below her collarbone, worn and plain. To her, they were more than metal. They were names. They were nights without sleep, days without answers. They were the memory of the ones who hadn't come back, the ones who didn't get to wear theirs anymore. She touched them briefly, then let go. The boys behind her laughed again, one of them imitating her posture, hips cocked, shoulders slouched, an apron tied around his waist like a costume. "Table 6 needs a hero," he jeered, raising his glass as if in toast. The others roared. voices filling the narrow diner until even the jukebox seemed to fall quiet. Clara didn't turn, didn't answer, just poured another cup of coffee for a weary driver at the counter who thanked her softly without ever looking up. In that moment, the diner was two worlds. One loud, mocking, brimming with youth that hadn't yet learned consequence. The other quiet, steady, carried by a woman who knew exactly what those tags cost and what they still meant. To the boys, she was a punchline. To herself, she was a keeper of memory. And to one man about to walk through that door, she was something else entirely. But that part comes later. For now, all she could do was endure the noise, the careless laughter, the way even strangers could reduce years of sacrifice to a joke. She didn't need to prove herself to them. She had nothing left to prove. And yet, as the bell above the diner door chimed and the air shifted, the weight of the room was about to change forever. Because sometimes silence holds longer than laughter. And sometimes, all it takes is one salute to remind a room exactly who someone really is. The bell above the diner door gave its tired chime, the kind that usually went unnoticed, drowned in the clatter of forks and the hum of conversation. But this time, the sound landed differently. The kind of sound that seemed to draw a line in the air, a before and after. A hush didn't fall, not yet, but the laughter dimmed, and the boys at the corner booth shifted just enough to glance over their shoulders. What they saw made them straighten unconsciously, though they tried to play it off with smirks. Colonel James Hayes had a presence that didn't need introduction. Broad-shouldered, his uniform pressed with the kind of sharpness that dared anyone to question it. Every ribbon and bar meticulously placed, silver eagles gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He wasn't there to eat. Not really. He was passing through, a man who could turn a roadside diner into a parade ground simply by existing in it. His eyes swept the room once, cool and precise, and the noise seemed to fold in on itself. Clara didn't look up right away. She was wiping down the counter, her movements steady, mechanical, the clink of the dog tags against her chest barely audible above the muffled jukebox. But Hayes saw them. He always did. His gaze fixed, not on the mocking soldiers, not on the crowded tables, but on the young woman at the counter. For a fraction of a second, something in his face shifted, not surprise, not shock, but recognition. The kind of recognition that carried memory behind it, the kind that said, "I know exactly who you are and what you've done." The corner booth didn't notice that shift. They were too busy leaning back, their voices rising again now that the first ripple of tension had passed. "You see the brass walk-in? Bet he's here for pie," one of them joked, nudging the others. Another added, "Maybe he'll give our waitress here a medal for best coffee service." Their laughter rang hollow, louder than before, desperate to reclaim the room they'd just lost. But Hayes ignored them completely. He walked with deliberate, unhurried steps, each one carrying weight across the checkered tiles until he stopped directly in front of Clara. She froze when she finally looked up, rag in hand, her breath catching for the briefest moment. She hadn't seen him in years, not since the desert heat, not since the smoke and chaos of a day she tried not to replay in her head. For an instant, she thought he wouldn't acknowledge her, that maybe he'd just order coffee and leave the past where it belonged. But he didn't. The colonel straightened, boots planted firm, and in the middle of that greasy diner filled with chatter and smirks, he raised his hand to his brow in a crisp, flawless salute. The kind of salute you don't offer lightly. The kind of salute you never give first unless it's earned. The diner went still. Forks hovered above plates. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the hum of the jukebox seemed to falter. The young soldiers at the booth stared, their smirks sliding into silence as the weight of what they were seeing crashed over them. A full-bird colonel, saluting the woman they had spent the last half-hour mocking. Clara didn't move at first. Her throat tightened, her eyes flicked briefly to the floor, then back to the man standing tall before her. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she raised her hand and returned the salute, the movement precise despite the tremor in her chest. For her, it wasn't about the audience or the humiliation she'd endured minutes earlier. It was about respect, an unspoken recognition that reached across time, across sacrifice. Colonel Hayes dropped his hand, but his voice carried clear enough for every person in that diner to hear. "Good to see you again, Staff Sergeant Mitchell." The titles hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Staff Sergeant. Not waitress. Not girl. not a punchline. Suddenly, the dog tags around her neck weren't relics or props. They were proof, stamped in steel, now echoed by the words of a man whose authority could silence a room without raising his voice. The corner booth sat in stunned silence, the color draining from their bravado. One of them opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. The others just stared at their plates, as if ashamed to meet her eyes. Around the room, other patrons shifted uncomfortably, guilt rising in the quiet. They had seen her mocked and said nothing. They had assumed, dismissed, laughed. And now, they realized just how wrong they had been. Clara lowered her hand, her voice soft but steady. "Sir, nothing more." She didn't need more. The respect was already there, wrapped in the silence that followed. Colonel Hayes gave her a small nod, the faintest flicker of a smile crossing his otherwise hard features. Then he turned his gaze toward the corner booth, his expression sharp as steel. The boys didn't laugh this time. They sat rigid, their earlier swagger shriveled under the weight of the truth. The colonel didn't need to say a word. His salute had already spoken for him. And just like that, the diner felt different. The laughter that once filled the room had vanished, replaced by something heavier, something that made even the air itself stand still. Because in that moment, everyone understood. She wasn't just a waitress with dog tags. She was a veteran, a soldier, a staff sergeant who had once stood where most of them never would. And now, finally, she was seen. The silence in the diner stretched long enough for the clock on the wall to tick twice, the sound sharp as a hammer in the stillness. Clara stood frozen, her rag still in hand, the dog tags warm against her chest, as if they had been waiting all this time for someone to notice. Colonel Hayes didn't break the moment. He let it settle, let every soul in the room carry the weight of what they had just witnessed. Only then did he speak again, his voice firm but calm, the way a commander addresses a formation. "Most of you don't know her," he said, his eyes cutting across the booths, across the guilty faces of the young soldiers. "But I do. Staff Sergeant Clara Mitchell saved lives when others didn't think it was possible, including mine." Gasps stirred at the edges of the room. Patrons leaned forward, caught between disbelief and shame. The soldiers at the corner booth sat rigid, their earlier laughter shriveled to silence. One of them muttered, She was Army?" His friend elbowed him, but no one else spoke. They didn't need to. The colonel's words had already turned their mockery into ash. Clara's lips parted as if to protest, but Hayes raised a hand slightly, silencing her with the kind of respect only earned in battle. "You don't have to tell them, Mitchell." "I will." Kandahar, 2017. Convoy ambush. "I was there. We all would have been gone if not for her. She pulled 3 wounded out under fire, refused evacuation until the last man was accounted for. Those dog tags." He pointed to the metal resting just below her collarbone. "They aren't decoration. They're a reminder of a soldier who never left anyone behind." The room felt smaller now, every breath heavier. Even the manager, who had grinned quietly at the earlier jokes, lowered his gaze to the register, shame creeping up his neck. The trucker at the counter whispered, "Damn," under his breath, shaking his head in quiet awe. Clara shifted, her cheeks flushed with an unease that wasn't embarrassment but humility. She didn't want this spotlight, didn't crave the correction of strangers' opinions. "Sir," she said softly, "I'm not a hero. I just did my job." Hayes gave a single nod, the corners of his mouth softening. "That's what every real hero says." The words landed heavier than any lecture could have. Across the diner, people who had once stared at her as just a waitress now sat straighter, their eyes lingering on the quiet figure behind the counter. Respect moved through the room like a tide, unspoken but undeniable. At the corner booth, the young soldiers who had mocked her finally broke. One of them stood, his chair scraping against the floor, and with trembling hands he gave a stiff salute in her direction. Another followed, then the rest. Not perfect salutes, not polished, parade ground sharp, but heavy with sincerity, weighted by shame. Clara didn't meet their eyes. She simply returned the gesture once, her hand rising and falling with the same quiet dignity she had carried all along. The colonel glanced at her one last time, his voice steady. "Carry on, Staff Sergeant." Then he turned and left, the bell above the door chiming again. But this time the sound didn't mark a beginning. It marked an ending, or maybe a reckoning. Clara lowered her gaze, picked up the rag again, and went back to wiping the counter. She didn't bask in the respect, didn't linger in the moment. She just did what she always did, quiet, steady, unassuming. But the room was changed. The laughter that had filled it an hour earlier could never return the same way. Because everyone there had seen it with their own eyes. The salute of a full colonel to a woman they had dismissed as a joke. And that truth would stay with them long after the smell of coffee and bacon faded from their clothes. Sometimes honor isn't shouted. Sometimes it doesn't need defending. Sometimes it simply waits, quiet, patient, until the world remembers. And that night, in a roadside diner where respect had once been a punchline, a single salute reminded everyone that honor never fades, and true service is never forgotten.